Welcome to Under the Rug at Work, where we shine light on issues that are normally swept under the rug. Today, I'm chatting with Samantha Sutherland, a DEI and gender equity consultant, about the barriers that women face in the workplace. Sam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you.
You too. And look, for some people who may not have met you before, can you tell us a bit about your background and what led you to focus on DEI and gender equity?
Yeah, well, I like to say in a past life, I was the head of risk and data in one of Australia's biggest utility companies. And then I took a very deliberate career right turn. And I think that my kind of focus on gender equity and like justice and fairness and stuff came from even when I was a kid, and I was like, my older brother shouldn't get more just because he's a boy or just because anything. I should be able to do the same things. And like, even to the fact of, I was telling the story to someone just the other day. When I was like 5, I can remember my dad saying he was going to take my brother to the cricket. And I said, well, the only reason you haven't invited me is because I'm a girl and I want to go to the cricket too. And so I got to go along to the cricket with my brother and my dad. And then that theme led throughout my life and throughout my experiences. And, when I was the head of risk, I would often be the youngest person and very often the only woman in the room in these conversations. And throughout my career in energy risk management, I was often the youngest only woman, and started to see that there was not necessarily always a path there for women. And even at that age, you kind of feel like you can do anything. But when women have children, very often then they hit the wall and realize, hit the maternal wall and realize that the things that they didn't see become very stark. My right turn into DI was I first wanted to work for a consultancy, and then I've been working in my own consultancy for about 5 years now with a real focus on gender equity. That's my kind of passion area, but then of course do all kinds of other unconscious bias training, psychological safety, inclusive leadership, broader inclusion stuff. But my passion is in the gender equity space. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of my background and how I ended up here.
Love that. And look, we have had many conversations before, and you often mention the mummy track and the maternal wall, as you just said too. How would you describe the concepts? And you have kind of mentioned it, but how do they hold women back at work?
Yeah, so the mummy track, neither of these concepts are things that I've made up myself. I have people that I would attribute them to, but I'm sure they got them from somewhere as well. Catherine Fox talks a lot about the mummy track. And really the idea is, and Amy Taylor-Kabbaz is the person who introduced me to the concept of the maternal wall. And she says women are much more likely to run into the maternal wall before they hit the glass ceiling. And I heard that sentence and was like, oh, I know exactly what she means. And the mummy track is this idea that once you have children, you are seen as less committed, less ambitious, and women hit a pay penalty for up to a decade. But actually, just yesterday I was speaking to somebody who called it a career scar. It's not just a period where it's a bit different, it's a scar that runs across the rest of your career. But also, the barriers aren't limited to you've had children and now you hit the maternal wall. There is also the maybe baby effect, where women hit a certain age and people start to assume they might have a baby, and so they can lose out on opportunities. I actually had a friend last year get asked, well, you just got married, are you going to have a baby soon? It's illegal to ask that question, but if someone asks you the question in an interview, what are you going to do about it? Take them to court to give you a job? Like, that's not how that works.
Yeah.
So you have the maybe baby effect. Then women have babies and they get put onto the mummy track. We know that 43% of highly educated career women take a career off ramp at some stage during their career. They call it a voluntary career off ramp, but the word voluntary is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. And then only 40% of them end up back in full-time work. So that is the mummy track. It's easier to find off ramps than it is to find on ramps. Your career can very easily get sidelined. And when you're a mother, you get seen differently. That's the motherhood penalty. And it can be hard to get back to full-time work, full-time career, full participation in the workforce. The maternal wall is obviously closely related, but it is this idea that once women have babies, we know that women then do about 70% of the caring work and domestic labour. So the value of free care and domestic labour in Australia is $650 billion. That is half of GDP is done for free mostly by women and is totally unaccounted for anywhere in the economy. And so if you are doing all of the domestic caring and you carry the majority of the mental load and you're also trying to have a career, then often you get very, very tired. And it's really normalized, as Cole Beck, who wrote White Feminism, says, it's normalized to be overwhelmed, overworked, overburdened, and have no time for rest. And that is the maternal wall. So we run into that and we're like, I don't want to hit the glass ceiling because how am I going to do that when I'm this exhausted? And so all of those things kind of work together in parallel. And I also just want to acknowledge that whilst women who can't or choose not to have children might not have, they might not hit the mummy track, they might not have a maternal wall, they do often face, first of all, the maybe baby effect, but also quite a lot of social stigma of, well, why don't you have children? Well, why wouldn't you want to do your highest calling in the world? And so they don't face that exact structural barrier. Sometimes they do a little bit anyway, but they get another social structural barrier that they face instead. So it's something that affects everybody, children or not.
Yes.
Every woman, children or not.
I love your passion and your simplicity in explaining this. And I can say from experience that I've had the maybe baby.
Yeah. Yeah.
The judgment and the hesitation. I don't think I have not been put forward for a job and been excluded from a job because of that, but I've seen it and heard it. Oh, she's at that age. Is she going to? And I do get asked the question, do you have children? And I say, no, I've got chickens.
So people ask me that question. So let me tell you a story from my own career about this. So in my energy utility days, I was working at that stage. I was something like the operational risk manager, and the company brought a New Zealand subsidiary, and two men from the New Zealand subsidiary came to Australia and spent a week with me going through all our risk metrics, all of our modeling, everything that we did, how we measured risk, how we hedged the position. Had a great week. I actually found it really interesting. I really enjoyed working with them, and I was like teaching them stuff, and I was like, oh, I do know quite a lot here. You know, sometimes in your career you get surprised, like, oh, I know something. So that happened and felt kind of satisfying. And then sometime, you know, like 2 or 3 months later, I went and spoke to my boss, who's a lovely guy, and we were talking about something else, and I was like, oh yeah, what's happening with the Kiwi team? Like, I haven't heard from them, but, you know, it's really good now. And he said, yeah, they're doing really well. Like, they actually really enjoyed working with you. You know, in fact, they asked if you wanted to do a secondment to New Zealand for 6 months, but I told them you're engaged and so you're planning a wedding and probably wouldn't want to go. And I was just like, what? I'm sorry, what? And like, I am adventurous. There's a good chance I would have taken that opportunity. It was a great career opportunity. New Zealand's close anyway. I wasn't planning some huge wedding. My then partner, then husband, now ex-husband would have probably come with me. He definitely would have supported me doing it. You know, like he would have been totally happy for me to go if he couldn't come because of his work. But I just never even heard about the opportunity because I was a woman who was engaged to be married. And the thing is, that guy that I was working for, he 100% would have thought he was doing me a favor, so I didn't have to awkwardly say no to this because I was actually planning my wedding. He's a lovely guy, doing what he thought was the best, but actually totally acting not in my best interest and not checking with me what I even wanted, you know. That's called benevolence bias, by the way.
I would just like to point out that if you're a leader or anyone, you should never make a decision for someone else. You never decide something on someone else's behalf. It doesn't matter what you think or why, that discussion needs to be had. So
it's about what your intent is. His was fully positive intent. So even if you have positive intent, don't make the decision for them.
No, we are all adults. We work with adults, and adults can make their own decisions. Oh, bless. Look, and you have touched on it a little bit, but another challenge that you often highlight is that second or third shift at home and that strain of balancing domestic responsibilities. Did you want to share anything more about that impact on women's career and well-being? We talked about how tiring and exhausting that is, and juggling all the balls and being all the things, and also the free work that gets done. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
I would add to it is this idea of the mental load, which isn't a phrase I said as we were talking earlier. And so lots of women know what the mental load is. And for those who don't, it is the kind of cognitive capacity that's required to run a household. And what we know just statistically is very often women do the thinking and the planning, and then they farm out the execution to the guy who then does the thing. But he doesn't have to spend any of his brain power thinking about the thing. He just has to go and do it. And when you look at every activity that happens in a household, the only one where men consistently do more of the thinking about it as well as the doing of it is taking out the trash. Every other one, women carry more of the mental load. And I actually had a podcast interview with a woman called Maya Polenka, who is on my podcast, Women at Work, where she was talking about this. And she said, we each have a limited amount of cognitive capacity in a day. And if 90% of the home is going into one brain, that brain then has less cognitive capacity left to put into work stuff. And so that's what we see is women carry the mental load. They are more likely to do the caring work. They're more likely to do more of the domestic labor. That then therefore means they're more likely to step back in their career for a period of time to do that caring work. And then they're on the mummy track and they're off, and then the two careers diverge. And so then it just makes sense from a family economic perspective that the guy continued to do all the hard paid work and the woman continued to do all the unpaid work, which isn't considered hard socially, but let's all agree it's very hard. And that mental load piece is a big part of what women are starting to talk about. Those words are making it more and more into the kind of public domain. The other thing too is that mental load piece becomes very stark when you have children, but is not limited to people who have children. So I have a friend who's a dog mum, not a chicken mum like you, but a dog mum. And she has said to me in the past, if I didn't do this thing for the dog, it would probably die because my husband wouldn't do that thing. I'm the one who thinks about all of this stuff to do with them. I'm the one who makes sure there's food, that they're fed at the right time, that they get the medicine they need, all of this stuff. And she saw that, I don't know if you've seen the French cartoon about the mental load. I'll send it to you so you can share it in the show notes if you want. It's actually great. If you don't share it, if you want to just Google it, Google French mental load cartoon and it will come up. And it's titled You Should Have Asked. And I sent her that and she was like, this is my life. This is my life. Obviously, it's like it is individual. There are some families where that mental load is more evenly distributed, but my experience and all the research shows that it's usually uneven, heavily weighted towards women doing more of it, and it's quite a battle to get that to be more even. So that's the other thing about that kind of second shift. The other piece, actually, sorry, I will add one more thing. I have been doing a research piece over all of 2024, talking to working mothers about their experience, what's going on in this post-pandemic world, what is happening. And one of the very common things that they say they wish people knew about what it's like to be a working mum is, by the time I get to work, which to you looks late because I'm coming in maybe at 9 a.m. I have lived a whole life. I was up at 6 o'clock in the morning, getting kids ready for daycare or school, making lunches, making breakfast, trying to get myself ready, trying to get into work, rushing around the place, feeling like a chicken with its head chopped off. Sorry, chicken. Shouldn't have used that analogy. Fluster in and everyone else thinks I'm late and they got to go to the gym and have a coffee and swan into work and they still got there before me. And that is a piece that a lot of people talk about is the second shift, which at work is really invisible. So we're doing all this stuff before work, then we go to work and then we do all this stuff after work and no one at work sees the before and after work stuff.
Yeah. And it is tough. And I am incredibly grateful that my husband and I share a lot of that. And we also have this uncanny ability that when one of us is unwell, the other is really well, so that we can kind of take on that responsibility for the other as well. So we have that complete downtime. And honestly, it does take away a lot of that pressure, a lot of that overwhelm. And I'm able to reach out and just say, I need help. I can't do this. I need you to do a bit more today rather than, just the normal 50-50. It is great to have that in the relationship. And I mention that because it is great, but also just have a think about your personal relationship.
Yeah, totally.
Whether it is, balanced. It doesn't have to be balanced all the time, but how do you feel it's going and how would you like to?
Yeah. I mean, when I talk to women who are experts in gender equity on my podcast and interview them, it's really common that when I
Yeah.
say, what advice would you give to people or what would you like people to think about? They say, who you pick as your partner makes a
Yeah.
huge difference to being able to meet your dreams.
Yes. 100%. Yes. I would agree with that too. Um, and let's shift on to hobbies. Because you talk about the hidden inequity with hobbies as well, and how women can lose out on personal fulfillment. Why do you think that that topic needs to bit more attention?
Interesting that it does highlight this inequality. Um, but it is hidden. Like you wouldn't, it's not obvious here. But when we think about hobbies, there are male coded hobbies and there are female coded hobbies. And those are the hobbies that tend to be done by people of one gender or another. Um, and male coded hobbies very often take you out of the house for a long time. Fishing, cycling, golf take you out of the house for a long time. A lot of the female coded hobbies are things that can be done kind of in the edges, definitely at home, gardening, reading, doing some yoga. Having a cup of tea isn't really a hobby, but it's like the kind of thing people do in their spare time. And the only female coded hobby that takes people out of the house for a really long time is horse riding. And the reason that I think that that is interesting is, first of all, many women identify with this, right? The number of women who are like, oh, we were on holiday and then all the women suddenly were like, how come all the men are out fishing and all the women are looking after the kids again? And then very quickly they're like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love my kids and I want to hang out with my kids, but also maybe we should all have access to the same amount of the equal quality leisure time. And by that I mean, if one partner gets to go out fishing or golfing or bike riding or horse riding, the other person doesn't get their free time to go to the supermarket. They get to do a thing that also gets them out of the house and properly recharges them. And it's not fair, maybe, for one person to have 8 hours of that time and one person to have 1 hour of that time.
Yeah.
And it shows, though, the other thing too, sorry, about it is the number of women who then, when I say, well, what do you do for fun? They're like, oh yeah, good, like funny, good joke, good joke. But also what I see, this is very anecdotal, this next bit I'm about to say, is that of the women that I speak to, the ones who seem to be the happiest are the ones who do get that time. So they do a regular dance class, or sometimes it's just going to the gym, but they love going to the gym and they feel better and alive and it's good for endorphins and serotonin and all that stuff. And they get to go to the gym 4 times a week and they feel they are happier because of it. The families or the households where like the guy gets to go and do that stuff and the woman is like, oh, I'll just do yoga in the living room again. And then they've got a toddler climbing on their back while they're trying to do it. Anecdotally, for sure, but less kind of content in their lives. And I think it's interesting how it helps uncover like who and what we value and how we show that we value that. And so to me, it's very related to the idea of who gets access to opportunities at work, how we see who is doing what with their time, what we value. We don't value care work, and we also don't value the female coded hobbies as much. So if someone was like, well, I'm just going to leave the house for 3 hours and read in the library, no one does that. A few people do that, right? That would be a huge feminist act to go and say, I'm leaving you with the kids to go and read in the library for 3 hours.
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting thing to look at in your relationship and be like, what does that split look like? A lot of what I hear is, well, on Saturdays he goes out for 4 or 6 or 8 hours and does his thing, and then on Sundays we have family day. And we want to have family day, so great. Like, of course we do that. But then what ends up happening is that we go back to this thing of the normalization of women being overworked, overburdened, overwhelmed, and not having any time for themselves to recharge. And then because also mother guilt makes us, especially if we're working full time, for example, we're not with the kids as much as we would like to be, we feel like, well, then in the other time I want to be with the kids. And to me, it's very much a both and situation. I love my kids. I want to be with them. I want us to have family time. And everybody deserves some time to recharge and fill their bucket and fill their cup. And we're better parents and partners and friends and workers if we do that as well.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I haven't delved into a topic like this for a really long time, and you are highlighting all of these points that it's like, I have that. That's really great. And oh, I've seen that. And
Yeah. Yeah.
um, yeah, these things you don't think about. You go, well, what do you mean by gender equity? What do you mean by DEI? And then you're like, oh, actually, this is really cool. And I mean, you have spoken about that burnout and overwhelm, but what role do they play in workplaces, or more so, how can workplaces and individuals tackle these issues? How can we get to that kind of practicality of it?
It's an interesting question because obviously what I'm talking about with all of this stuff is the intersection of home and work, right? It's not just about what's happening. They're not separate from each other. I mean, burnout and overwhelm have significant impacts in terms of worker productivity, workforce participation. You know, if we have people really burning out, then they leave the workforce. Like, you would know a lot about that stuff in your area of focus. And workplaces have a role to play in making sure that their policies and practices are set up to prevent that as much as possible. Some of that looks like stuff like flex, and flex is more than just you can work 4 days a week, and often that means you can work 4 days a week, but you can do a 5-day workload for 80% of the pay. A bit more stress, but actually true flexibility about when you work, where you work, how you work, and having roles that are based on output rather than time, visible time at work. Proper job design, which again is something that would come through in the psychosocial risk legislation stuff, which is like, are people clear on what they're meant to do? Is it clear what their deliverables are? Is the workload reasonable? All of that kind of stuff. Another interesting workplace connection is the idea of office housework, but also kind of office social work. So this is additional work that gets done in the workplace that is non-promotable. So running the social club, making sure there are cupcakes at the something or other thing, note taking in meetings where it's not your meeting and you're not the secretary. Those are non-promotable tasks. They're tasks that can make you very busy, but are not considered valuable from a productivity viewpoint by the workplace. What we know is that women volunteer to do it more, they get asked to do it more, and when they are asked to do that kind of stuff, they say yes more often. And so workplaces can put in place guardrails to make sure that it's not just women who are being asked, but also not just the same few women who are being asked to do those non-promotable tasks in workplaces. Either put them into a job description or don't make them compulsory, or make sure that it's like 50-50 participation that is spread around amongst people. Making sure that workplaces are set up so that men can participate properly in the home. So a good example of that is parental leave. There are still plenty of workplaces. There are more and more workplaces that have parental leave provisions that are saying whether you're the birthing parent or the non-birthing parent. And so each parent gets 4 months off work, they get to be primary carer. We know that when that happens, when the non-birthing parent also spends time as primary carer for a period of time, the outcomes across the whole family are better for the long term, not just in that period they're at home. But there are still plenty of workplaces where mum gets 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and dad gets 2 weeks. Like 2 weeks is still a thing that happens all the time. So workplaces that do that embed the idea of a male breadwinner model where the guy goes to work and he works really hard and he doesn't get to see his family, and the woman is at home and she does all the care work and her career suffers because of it. Another thing that isn't quite the question that you asked, but that I think is interesting, is there are, of course, still some men who are like, well, I just want to go to work and I want my wife to be at home looking after the kids. But more and more men are saying, I want to be part of the family life too. So I've had a couple of examples of a guy saying to me, you know, these big companies, they pay men to not see their families, and I don't want to do that anymore. And I had another man that I was talking to who had asked to work a condensed week. So he wanted to do 5 days in 4 so that he could do school, drop off and pick up one day and spend the day with the kid who wasn't in daycare. So one school age and one in daycare. And he did it for 3 months. Everything worked really well. And this was like ASX 200 company, a big company. All went really well. He was happy, managers were happy, work was getting done. And at the end of it, HR said to him, well, you can't do that, because if you can't continue doing it, because if you do that, everyone will do that. And flexibility is for working mothers, not even parents. but also other people have needs who aren't parents.
Yeah.
And then another third example of this is a guy that I was talking to who works at one of the big four, and he wanted to take part-time parental leave. So in his organization, I think they did have like equal access. So he got something like 4 months or 6 months of parental leave, and he wanted to take it half a day a week, half a day a fortnight, actually, for however long. And he got told that doing that would delay getting partnership by 18 months. That is ludicrous. If you're doing a 9.5 day fortnight, you 100% are doing the full amount of work that is meant to be done in that job. You're being paid a bit less. Well, he's not being paid because he's taking the leave, but he's doing the full workload, but he has a corralled time that he's spending with family. And that message is very strong. Work and family are incompatible in this organization. And your question was kind of back to burnout and overwhelm, but to go back to that is all of these things feed into that. How do companies support families as a whole? How do they look at job design, flexibility design, policy? How do they put those policies into practice? And all of that picture then feeds into burnout and overwhelm. Same as there's never one single cause of it. You don't get burnt out just because you have to be in the office 5 days a week. You get burnt out because of the whole big picture.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And the 5 day work week, 9 to 5, 8 till 7, like that is dying. And companies who refuse flexibility are losing good workers, because if COVID's taught us anything, it's that family is a priority and work isn't the only thing that we have to value now. And I was talking to someone earlier today about loyalty. Like, people used to stay for loyalty, but they're not receiving loyalty anymore. So the lack of those flexible work options will lead not only to losing people, but it can also lead to women overworking or overcompensating in really unhealthy ways, women, parents, and anyone. What kind of practical solutions should employers consider to prevent that?
So before I answer that, I want to just go back to the loyalty piece for a second, because I think this is a really interesting point. So the motherhood penalty means women are seen as less ambitious, less committed. They get less opportunities. They're more likely to be sidelined, all of that stuff. Flexibility, we know, is like the number one lever that keeps women connected to the workforce and keeps them participating. When you have an organization where women do not face motherhood penalty type impacts, right? Like they are still given opportunities, they still get to do interesting work, they aren't sidelined because they are a mother, and they have flexibility that allows them to manage their career and their family, because we know that in Australia, 67% or something of domestic and care work is done by women. So it allows them to manage that. Instead of the flight risk, the non-committed flight risk that women can be seen as when they become mothers, they actually are hugely loyal, right? When women are in a company that respects them, that gives them opportunities, that pays them fairly, and that gives them flexibility, they will stay for a very long time. They're hugely sticky employees and very loyal to the organization. And I think it's companies at their peril don't recognize that and just see women, once they become mothers, as non-committed flight risks. So that's my loyalty piece. Now, the question was, how do you get people to not overcompensate for lack of, sorry, what was the question?
What are some practical solutions that employers can consider to prevent that overwork and overcompensation when there aren't those flexible work options, besides including flexible work options?
Right. So, and I mean, there's never a simple solution there's never one single simple solution to this kind of thing. I'm a big advocate for talking to the women in your organization, because they will tell you what the issues are. They will know your specific issues. And in fact, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency has 6 gender equity indicators, and one of them is workforce, what's the word? Like asking questions of your workforce. Sorry, I forgot the word for a second. And so if you have a workforce where you start to think that people are getting overwhelmed and burnt out, ask them what is going on, and because people don't want to have to get a new job. They don't want to have to change things up. A lot of people are like, better the devil you know. Yeah. People want to find a solution that works for them and works for you. And so they're invested in it working. So harness that. And you're invested in working. Everyone's invested in working. Let's place the problem over there and be together trying to solve the problem rather than adversarial against, well, I need you to work harder and, well, I don't want to work as hard as you want because I'm burnt out. And so that would be my first thing, is like talk to the women in your workforce and everybody in your workforce about what you think, what they think needs to happen to improve what's going on.
Consultation is a legal requirement as well under the Work Health and Safety Act. So just throwing that in there.
Consultation's the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's like a requirement under that act, and then it's also not a requirement under WGEA, but it is like a best practice recommendation that you do that work, and it's something that gets reported on whether you do that or not. Then job design and actually understanding what the outputs of roles are. So the number of women that I've spoken to who've said, like one example was a woman who was working, she had been really overwhelmed and burnt out. So she decided to go down to part-time and kind of change her role. Very often when women work part-time, they want to make sure that people believe that they're still committed and show that they're still capable at doing their job. And so then she was working harder and harder and taking on more and more stuff. And she was being paid for 3 days work, but she said she felt like she was working around the clock and never had any time off, and was also with her kids, but trying to work and not focused. And she ended up quitting. And when she did her handover notes for her boss, the boss was like, this is literally a handover for 3 jobs. And she was doing 3 jobs in 3 days. It is not ideal for the manager to have no idea that that was what was happening until she had resigned. Yeah. And that's not good for anybody, because it's not good for the person who got burnt out. It's not good for the manager who now has to fill 3 roles. It's not good for the organization. The cost of turnover and replacement costs are very, sort of like 1 to 2 times the salary of the person who's departing. In that instance, it would be even higher because she was doing so much work. So being aware of what's happening and understanding outputs and understanding who's doing what work. And, there's someone that I'm working with at the moment who has 1 direct manager, but is actually doing work for 3 managers who aren't talking to each other. And so she doesn't know what to prioritize, and she's trying to do everything for everybody. She wants to make sure everybody thinks she's doing a good job. They are sometimes talking about her, but not necessarily about what the workload is. And so she's in a really difficult position where she needs to make sure at a minimum that they each know what she's being asked to do, while still not trying to sound like she's saying no, she's not going to do it. And that kind of reporting line setup is the kind of thing that leads to overwork. Another thing too is, I think when we understand the systems that we're operating in, then it can be easier to navigate it. So we know that the number one cited fear for women when they go off on parental leave is that they're going to be sidelined or forgotten when they come back. What that means is they have a very big drive when they return to show that they're still hard worker, they can still do everything they did before, they're still smart, they still know what they're doing. And of course, they're also often coming back thinking, I don't know, can I? Am I dumb now? There is a real confidence here that women seem to have when they go off on parental leave. So that can cause women to overwork. Now, the other thing we know is that the number one fear cited by men when they go off and have children is job security, being able to provide for their family. Also, on average, when men have their first child, they actually work 4 hours more a week because they love their family so much and they're so worried about being able to provide for them that they need to prove at work that they're doing a good job. When organizations and managers are aware of this, then you can look out for markers of this. People like online sending emails at midnight, tell them not to do that. Check in what their workload is, find out what is driving that behavior. Is it overwork? Is it and, if it's sometimes and people have a big project on, maybe everybody works late sometimes, but look for patterns in what's happening for how people are turning up and showing up. Obviously, I think everybody should be offering some form of flexibility, both in hours and location. And also, making sure that all roles are available to do flex. I was working with one organization where they were like, oh, well, there's no women. We can't understand it. There's no women once you get to this operational manager level. And then they eventually said, well, yeah, but you can't work part-time in those jobs. It's like, well, the majority, 30% of women work part-time, 7% of manager roles are part-time in Australia. And of those, they're heavily concentrated in feminized industries. So if you are not a feminized industry like nursing, education, and you don't have any women in management and you have people working part-time, well, there is a direct issue right there that you can solve.
Yeah.
So Again, there's never like one silver bullet, but there's lots of levers that you can pull to try and solve these issues. And I always say, like I said at the beginning, start with your women and ask them.
Yes. There is so much gold in this podcast. So I really appreciate it. And look, we've spoken about the glass ceiling and the glass wall. I want to move to the glass cliff. And sometimes women are placed on the glass cliff when they're set up to fail when taking on leadership roles, as you've just said. Other than flexibility, how can organizations avoid creating those precarious situations?
Yeah, so the glass cliff is not a thing that's solved by flexibility. The glass cliff, just to explain to people a bit more about what it is, it's the idea that when an organization is kind of floundering, they will remove a male CEO and put in a female CEO. The glass cliff only applies to really quite senior positions,
Right.
or managerial roles where you're going in where there's a massive problem. And so they haven't had a woman in the position before. Now they're putting a woman in, and then if she fails because she's coming into a sinking ship, well, then there's a very good chance that people can blame the fact that she's a woman for being there for the failure, rather than the fact that she was put into a role that just was never going to be able to succeed. Again, this kind of thing I don't think is solved by, there's no silver bullet answer. I don't think flexibility is the solution here. This is a broader cultural issue, which is, are women given leadership opportunities in your organization when it's not precarious? Do you have targets for gender equality, like gender equal numbers at different levels of your organization? So as an example, there's an initiative called the 40/40 Vision that I was the secretariat for the first couple of years of its life, which was initiated by HESTA, the super fund. And they have got a whole lot of other asset and funds management organizations on board. And they're trying to get all ASX 300 companies to commit to 40% men, 40% women, 20% any gender in their executive leadership team. So targets like that mean that the only opportunities that come available to put women in aren't the ones where they're going to fall off the glass cliff. And so the reason I was saying it's not just the most senior levels, but it's glass cliff because you're put in up high and then you drop off the cliff, but that only works if it's sort of like a high position. But that idea of, do we have some kind of gender parity across executive levels, senior executive leadership, senior leadership levels, middle management, what does that look like sort of through the pipeline? And a cultural piece around recognizing that that's potentially what's happening. So, do we acknowledge that this is a precarious position? Who have we considered for it? Have we considered those people for roles that are not precarious? Or are we only thinking about bringing them in when there's a potential problem? Yeah. I kind of think the glass cliff is like not necessarily in itself something to be solved, because it's a symptom of a larger problem, usually, of just general gender inequity within an organization.
Yeah, good point. I'm learning so much. I love this. Thank you. So if there was one thing that you could tell leaders to improve the experiences of working women, what would that be?
That's a good question. I feel like I should have a soundbite answer for that ready to go. I think if there's one thing I would want leaders to know, it would be that your women are just as invested in finding a solution as you are. And so don't feel like A, you need to know everything and like parachute in the perfect solution, or B, that you're like against them in it. We are all part of a system that is much bigger than ourselves. And when we understand that, then we can work to actually change the system, and we can all better navigate it. When we don't see that it's a structural problem, we can take offense, or we can think that it's individual, or, not feel like there's a solution that can actually make an impact more broadly than the thing we can touch, So I think it would be that. If I could also answer this question from one thing I would love working women to know, is when you understand the system, you can see that all of this is much bigger than you are. And what happens is we are trying to cobbled together individual solutions to a structural problem, which means we end up thinking, if only I was smarter, I had a better to-do list, I knew how to do this, I worked harder, I slept a little bit less, if only something was different about me. We end up thinking it is our own personal deficiency that is causing these problems, but it's a structural problem that needs structural solutions. Within that, of course, we want to have agency. We want to feel like we can influence stuff, and we can, and there are ways we can do that. But if you feel like your career is being hampered, or that you can't do it all, or you feel overwhelmed and burnt out, it is because that is a symptom of a much bigger issue than your deficiency. You're doing a great job, and the system needs to change, and we need to work to make that happen.
Yeah. Look, Sam, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for shining light on the barriers that women face. There was a lot to unpack, and we could honestly talk for hours. But how can people best connect with you if they want to learn more and find out more?
So best place is my website, which is samanthasutherland.com.au. I also put a lot of stuff on LinkedIn. I have a podcast called Women at Work with Samantha Sutherland. And those are the best places. And also at this time of year, if you're looking for an International Women's Day speaker, give me a call.
Awesome. I will put those links in the show notes for easy access for people. And for anyone listening, if you found this conversation helpful, please subscribe and share it. We'll see you next time on Under the Rug at Work, where we continue to address the issues that are too often swept under the rug.